The train station was huge, loud, and incredibly busy. It was one of those places where everyone is always in a rush, running to catch a train or talking loudly on their phones. The air smelled like old coffee, wet raincoats, and cheap fast food. In the middle of all this noise and chaos walked an old man. He didn't look like he belonged in such a fast-paced world. He moved very slowly. His steps were small and careful, as if he was walking on a slippery floor, even though it was dry concrete. He was wearing a thick, gray coat that looked like it was from another time. It was clean, but it was old-fashioned. In one hand, he gripped a wooden walking stick so tightly his knuckles were white. His other hand was being held gently by a younger woman, his daughter. She walked beside him, trying to match his slow pace, but it was difficult. Every time she stopped, someone behind her would sigh loudly or bump into her shoulder, annoyed that she wasn't moving faster. "Careful, Dad," she said softly, guiding him around a metal bench. "Watch your step." The old man didn't answer. He just kept his eyes fixed on the floor. He seemed to be fascinated by the scuff marks on the tiles, as if they were a map he was trying to read. He looked confused. To the hundreds of people rushing past them, he was invisible. He was just a slow obstacle in their way. A businessman in a sharp suit brushed past them, almost hitting the old man's shoulder, but he didn't even stop to say sorry. He just kept running toward his train. The daughter felt a heavy weight in her chest. It wasn't just the stress of the travel or the heavy bags they were carrying. It was the sadness of seeing her father like this. She remembered him differently. 10 years ago, this man was the strongest person she knew. He used to walk fast with his head held high, leading the way. He used to tell loud jokes and fix things around the house with his big, rough hands. But now, things had changed. The doctors called it dementia. They used big medical words, but she knew what it really meant. It meant his mind was slowly erasing itself, like a pencil drawing being rubbed out bit by bit. "Are we there yet?" he asked suddenly. His voice was shaky and thin. "We are almost there, Dad," she lied gently. They had only just entered the main hall. Just a little bit further. He stopped walking and looked up. He looked at the giant departure board with the yellow letters changing constantly. He looked at the high glass roof where the rain was hitting. For a moment, a flash of panic crossed his face. It was the look of a child who realizes they are lost in a supermarket. I don't know where I am," he whispered. His hand started to tremble in hers. The woman squeezed his hand back, fighting back tears. "I know, it's okay. I'm here. I've got you." She felt guilty. Today was a hard day. They weren't going on a holiday or a fun trip. They were heading to a new facility, a place that specialized in care for people like him. She could no longer take care of him alone at home. It was too dangerous. He would leave the stove on or wander outside at night. Making this decision felt like she was betraying him, even though she knew it was for his own safety. She felt like she was abandoning the man who had raised her. They found a quiet spot near the waiting area. She sat him down on a hard plastic chair and sat down next to him, exhausted. She took a deep breath and rubbed her temples. She checked her watch. They had 20 minutes before they needed to go to the platform. She needed a coffee. She needed a minute to just breathe. "I'll be right back, Dad," she said, standing up. "I'm just going to get a water." "Stay here. Don't move." He looked at her, his eyes cloudy and unfocused. He nodded slowly. "Okay, water." She walked toward a vending machine a few meters away. It wasn't far, but she kept looking back every 2 seconds to check on him. He sat still, staring at his hands resting on top of his walking stick. He looked so small and fragile in that massive, noisy hall. He looked completely defeated by life. People walked right in front of him, blocking his view, carrying suitcases and yelling into their phones. He didn't react. He just sat there, trapped inside a head that couldn't keep up with the world anymore. At the vending machine, the woman struggled to find a coin in her purse. Her hands were shaking a little too, from the stress. She felt the weight of everyone's eyes on her, judging her for taking up space. She felt alone in a crowd of thousands. It was the worst feeling in the world being lonely when you are surrounded by people while she was distracted. Looking down at her purse, the old man shifted in his seat. His legs were feeling stiff. The noise of the station was hurting his ears. He heard something else, though. It wasn't the shouting or the announcement bells. It was a sound coming from the center of the hall. A faint, rhythmic sound that tugged at something deep inside his memory. It was a sound he didn't recognize, but his body did. He stood up. His legs were weak, but curiosity gave him a spark of energy. He forgot about the chair. He forgot about his daughter telling him to stay. He started to walk toward the sound. He shuffled past the crowds, ducking under a suitcase held by a tall traveler. He moved like a man sleepwalking, guided only by an invisible pull. The woman turned around with a bottle of water in her hand. Her heart stopped. The chair was empty. "No," she gasped. She looked left. She looked right. The sea of people was moving fast, swallowing up the space where he had been sitting just a moment ago. Panic surged through her veins. How could he disappear so fast? Why didn't he listen? She scanned the crowd, looking for the gray coat, the walking stick, the slow, hunched figure. But there were too many people. "Dad?" She called out, but her voice was lost in the noise of the station. She started to push her way through the crowd, apologizing but not stopping. She was terrified he had fallen or that he had walked out into the rain and gotten lost. She needed to find him. She didn't know that he wasn't lost. He knew exactly where he was going, even if he didn't know why. He was walking toward the piano in the middle of the hall, drawn by a ghost from his past. The young woman pushed her way through the river of people, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The bottle of water was still cold in her hand, but her palms were sweating. Every face she looked at was a stranger, a tired businessman, a laughing tourist, a student with headphones. None of them were him? Dad? She called out, but her voice was weak, swallowed instantly by the echoes of the station. "Dad!" Panic began to rise in her throat, bitter and sharp. How could she have looked away for just 10 seconds? How could she have been so stupid? The station was a maze. He didn't know where he was going. He didn't even know who he was half the time. She pictured him falling down the escalator or wandering out onto the busy street, or standing somewhere crying because he couldn't find her. The guilt hit her so hard it almost made her stop. She promised to take care of him, and now he was gone. She spun around, scanning the crowd desperately. Then she saw it. A small gap in the mass of bodies. Through that gap, she saw the familiar gray coat. He wasn't on the floor. He wasn't lost at an exit. He was walking toward the center of the hall. She let out a breath she didn't know she was holding and started to run, dodging people and muttering apologies. But as she got closer, she realized where he was heading. In the middle of the large atrium, there was a grand piano. It was a shiny black beast of an instrument, sitting there under the harsh lights. It was meant for public art, for anyone to play, but usually it was just ignored by the rushing commuters. At that moment, however, a young man was sitting at the piano. He had a hoodie pulled up over his head and expensive sneakers on his feet. He was playing very fast, very loud notes. He wasn't playing a song that people recognized. He was just showing off. His fingers flew across the keys, hitting them hard. He was looking around, grinning, trying to see if people were watching. A few people had stopped, holding up phones to record him, but most just walked faster to get away from the noise. The old man shuffled closer to the scene. He moved with a strange determination, ignoring the people who bumped his shoulders. His eyes were fixed on the piano. He watched the young man's hands. He seemed mesmerized by the movement. By the sound vibrating through the air, the young pianist finished with a loud, crashing chord that echoed through the hall. He smiled at his phone camera, gave a little bow to no one in particular, and stood up. He grabbed his backpack and walked away, leaving the piano bench empty. The crowd that had gathered lost interest immediately and started to disperse. The show was over. The daughter was still 50 feet away, shouting, "Dad, wait!" Stop, but he didn't hear her. He walked up to the piano. He stood there for a moment, looking small and fragile next to the large, gleaming instrument. He reached out a hand and touched the smooth wood, as if checking to see if it was real. A security guard, who had been leaning against a pillar nearby, pushed himself off. He looked at the old man with a mix of annoyance and concern. It was his job to make sure people didn't cause trouble, and a confused old man at a piano seemed like trouble waiting to happen. He started walking over, his hand moving toward the radio on his shoulder. "Sir, you can't be over there," the guard said firmly. Though he wasn't close enough to be heard yet, the people walking past slowed down to look. They saw an old man with a cane standing too close to expensive equipment. They saw the security guard approaching. They expected a scene. They expected the old man to get confused, maybe to try to sit down and fall, or maybe to start banging on the keys like a toddler. The daughter finally broke through the crowd, her face red and terrified. "Dad, please, come back," she pleaded, reaching out a hand. "We have to go." The old man didn't turn around. He didn't look at his daughter. He didn't look at the security guard. He was locked in a different world. He gripped the top of the piano to steady himself. Then, slowly, painfully slowly, he turned his body. He lifted one leg and swung it over the bench. He sat down. A ripple of whispers moved through the few people who were still watching. "Is he going to play?" A young man laughed, nudging his friend. "This should be good." "Look at his hands," someone else whispered. "They're shaking." The old man's hands were indeed trembling. They were swollen at the joints, the skin thin and spotted with age. They looked like the hands of a laborer, not a musician. He hovered them over the keys, his fingers curled like claws. He stared at the black and white notes as if they were a foreign language. He was trying to remember. The security guard was just a few steps away now. "All right, sir, time to move along." "You can't sit there." The daughter reached the piano, breathless. She saw the guard coming and her dad sitting there, looking like a confused child. She felt the hot embarrassment of everyone staring at them. "I'm so sorry," she said to the guard, putting a hand on her father's shoulder. "He's confused. We are leaving right now." "Dad, get up." She touched his shoulder to pull him back, but then she stopped. Under her hand, she felt his muscles tense. It wasn't the tense of fear or confusion. It was the tense of concentration. His back straightened. The slump in his shoulders vanished instantly. He shook off her hand gently, not to be mean, but because he needed focus. The silence around the piano began to grow. The mocking laughter died down. The guard stopped walking. Something in the air changed. There was a sudden shift in the old man's demeanor. The confused, foggy look in his eyes cleared, replaced by a sharp, intense gaze. He didn't look like a lost grandfather anymore. He looked like a man about to work. He lowered his trembling hands. The daughter held her breath, expecting a clumsy, discordant noise. She expected him to hit a wrong note and startle everyone. The whole station seemed to pause, waiting for the awkward moment to end so they could go back to their busy lives. The old man took a deep breath, filling his lungs with the dusty station air. He closed his eyes for just a second. Then he placed his right hand on the keys and pressed down. The sound that came out was not a thud. It was not a mistake. It was a clear, resonant chord that hung in the air like a thunderclap. It was so full and rich that it seemed to silence the announcements, the trains, and the crowd. The daughter froze. The guard stood still. The boy with the phone camera slowly lowered his device, his mouth falling open. No one expected this. Not yet, but they were about to. The silence that followed that first chord was heavy. It wasn't just quiet. It was the kind of stillness that happens when something unexpected grabs a room by the throat and demands attention. The guard froze with his hand halfway to his radio. The daughter stopped pulling at her father's arm, her fingers hovering in midair. Even the noisy announcements over the loudspeakers seemed to fade into the background, swallowed by the power of that single, perfect sound, before anyone could blink or even take a breath. The old man's hands moved again. This time, his left hand came down on the lower keys, deep and booming. It was a rhythm that felt like a heartbeat. Then, his right hand danced up the high keys, creating a sound like rain falling on a tin roof. It was fast, impossibly fast. The noise that came out of the instrument wasn't just a song. It was a storm. It was complex, intricate, and beautiful. A collective gasp went through the crowd. It started as a low murmur, but it grew quickly. People who were walking past the piano just 10 seconds ago were now skidding to a halt. They turned their heads, their eyes wide. They couldn't believe what they were hearing. The young man with the hoodie, who had been playing loud, clumsy chords just moments ago, was standing 5 feet away. He looked at the old man's hands, then down at his own phone. He slowly lowered the device, his mouth hanging open. He had thought he was good. He realized now that he didn't know anything. The daughter stood behind the bench, completely stunned. She knew her father had played the piano when he was younger. She had seen an old photo of him sitting at a shiny instrument in a tuxedo. A long time ago, but he had never played for her. He had never even mentioned it in recent years. She had assumed that dementia had stolen that skill along with his memories. She thought his hands were too weak, his mind too broken. But looking at him now, she realized she was wrong. His hands, which usually shook so badly that he couldn't hold a spoon without spilling soup, were suddenly steady. It looked like a miracle. The arthritis that usually curled his fingers into painful claws seemed to vanish. His fingers were flying across the keys, striking them with precision and force. He wasn't hitting one wrong note. Every sound was crisp, clear, and full of emotion. The music he played was intense. It wasn't a happy, simple tune. It was dramatic and serious, full of ups and downs. It sounded like the story of a life, sometimes sad, sometimes angry, sometimes full of joy. As he played, his face changed. The confused, frightened look was gone. His eyes were closed, his head tilted slightly back. He looked like he was somewhere else, maybe in a memory, maybe in a dream. He looked peaceful, yet powerful. The crowd began to grow. A businessman who was rushing to catch a train stopped to watch. He checked his watch, then looked at the old man, and slowly put his watch back in his pocket. He missed his train, but he didn't seem to care. A mother with a crying baby stopped rocking the stroller. The baby stopped crying, mesmerized by the noise. 2 teenagers who were laughing loudly fell silent. They took off their headphones and listened. The security guard, who had come over to scold the man for sitting on the piano, slowly lowered his radio. He crossed his arms over his chest and leaned back against a pillar. A small smile appeared on his face. He had seen a lot of weird things in this station, but he had never seen anything like this. He decided the man could stay. For now, the rules didn't matter. The sound filled the massive hall. It bounced off the walls and the glass ceiling. The vibration of the music could be felt in the floor. It was a sound that demanded respect. It stripped away the noise of the modern world, the texting, the rushing, the greed, and replaced it with something raw and real. The daughter felt tears burning in her eyes. She watched her father's hands, the same hands that had held her when she was a baby, the same hands that had built things for their home. Seeing them move with such grace and speed was heartbreaking and wonderful all at once. It was like seeing a ghost of the man he used to be. For these few minutes, the fog of dementia had lifted. The disease that had tried to erase him had no power over the music. The music lived in his muscles and his bones. Deeper than his memory could go, he shifted his body, his foot pressing down on the pedals to make the sound sustain, letting the notes blur together into a long, beautiful cry. The emotion in the hall was thick. Strangers were looking at each other, sharing a moment of connection that rarely happens in a big city. Some people had their phones out now, but they weren't holding them up to mock him. They were recording the moment because they knew no one would believe them otherwise. They were capturing proof that magic exists. The music swelled, getting louder and faster. The old man's shoulders hunched forward as he put everything he had into the instrument. He was playing with a passion that seemed almost desperate, like he was trying to say everything he couldn't speak aloud. He was telling the crowd that he was still here. He was still a person. He still had a soul. As the song reached its highest point, the entire station stopped. The escalators kept moving and the trains kept arriving, but the people were frozen. It was a sea of coats and bags and scarves, all focused on one small, frail man in a gray coat. He wasn't an invisible old man anymore. He was the center of the universe. He was a king sitting on his throne, and the piano was his kingdom. Just as the daughter thought her heart might burst from the intensity of it all, the music began to change. The rushing notes slowed down. The loud thunder turned into soft, gentle rain. He was bringing it to an end. The crowd leaned in, holding their breath, afraid that if they made a sound, the spell would break. They didn't want it to stop. They wanted to stay in this moment where the world was beautiful and nothing else mattered. The old man hit the final few notes, soft and delicate, like a whisper. Then his hands lifted off the keys and hovered in the air. Think. The silence that followed that first chord was heavy. It wasn't just quiet. It was the kind of stillness that happens when something unexpected grabs a room by the throat and demands attention. The guard froze with his hand halfway to his radio. The daughter stopped pulling at her father's arm, her fingers hovering in midair. Even the noisy announcements over the loudspeakers seemed to fade into the background, swallowed by the power of that single, perfect sound. Before anyone could blink or even take a breath, the old man's hands moved again. This time, his left hand came down on the lower keys, deep and booming. It was a rhythm that felt like a heartbeat. Then his right hand danced up the high keys, creating a sound like rain falling on a tin roof. It was fast, impossibly fast. The noise that came out of the instrument wasn't just a song. It was a storm. It was complex, intricate, and beautiful. A collective gasp went through the crowd. It started as a low murmur, but it grew quickly. People who were walking past the piano just 10 seconds ago were now skidding to a halt. They turned their heads, their eyes wide. They couldn't believe what they were hearing. The young man with the hoodie, who had been playing loud, clumsy chords just moments ago, was standing 5 feet away. He looked at the old man's hands, then down at his own phone. He slowly lowered the device, his mouth hanging open. He had thought he was good. He realized now that he didn't know anything. The daughter stood behind the bench, completely stunned. She knew her father had played the piano when he was younger. She had seen an old photo of him sitting at a shiny instrument in a tuxedo. A long time ago, but he had never played for her. He had never even mentioned it in recent years. She had assumed that dementia had stolen that skill along with his memories. She thought his hands were too weak, his mind too broken. But looking at him now, she realized she was wrong. His hands, which usually shook so badly that he couldn't hold a spoon without spilling soup, were suddenly steady. It looked like a miracle. The arthritis that usually curled his fingers into painful claws seemed to vanish. His fingers were flying across the keys, striking them with precision and force. He wasn't hitting one wrong note. Every sound was crisp, clear, and full of emotion. The music he played was intense. It wasn't a happy, simple tune. It was dramatic and serious, full of ups and downs. It sounded like the story of a life, sometimes sad, sometimes angry, sometimes full of joy. As he played, his face changed. The confused, frightened look was gone. His eyes were closed, his head tilted slightly back. He looked like he was somewhere else, maybe in a memory, maybe in a dream. He looked peaceful, yet powerful. The crowd began to grow. A businessman who was rushing to catch a train stopped to watch. He checked his watch, then looked at the old man, and slowly put his watch back in his pocket. He missed his train, but he didn't seem to care. A mother with a crying baby stopped rocking the stroller. The baby stopped crying, mesmerized by the noise. 2 teenagers who were laughing loudly fell silent. They took off their headphones and listened. The security guard, who had come over to scold the man for sitting on the piano, slowly lowered his radio. He crossed his arms over his chest and leaned back against a pillar. A small smile appeared on his face. He had seen a lot of weird things in this station, but he had never seen anything like this. He decided the man could stay. For now, the rules didn't matter. The sound filled the massive hall. It bounced off the walls and the glass ceiling. The vibration of the music could be felt in the floor. It was a sound that the last note of the song seemed to hang in the air forever, vibrating against the high ceiling of the station. It was a soft, trembling sound that slowly faded into silence, but the silence itself felt heavy. It felt alive. For maybe 10 seconds, no one in the entire bustling hall moved. No one spoke. The rushing commuters who were usually annoyed at any delay were standing still, their mouths slightly open, their eyes fixed on the small, hunched figure on the piano bench. It was as if the old man had cast a spell over the station. He had taken a noisy, dirty, stressful place and turned it into a cathedral for a few minutes. Then the silence broke. It started with one person clapping slow, rhythmic taps. Then, like a wave crashing on the shore, the rest of the crowd joined in. It wasn't the polite, quiet clapping you hear at a boring speech. It was loud. It was a roar of appreciation. People were cheering, whistling, and shouting, "Bravo!" The sound was overwhelming, bouncing off the marble floors and walls. The businessman who had missed his train was clapping so hard his hands were red. The teenager with the phone was holding it up again, but this time he was recording with a look of total respect on his face, zooming in on the old man's hands. The mother with the baby was wiping tears from her eyes with her sleeve. Even the security guard was clapping, a broad smile stretching across his face. The daughter stood behind the bench, crying freely now. She wasn't hiding it. She looked around at the hundreds of strangers and saw that they weren't looking at her father with pity anymore. They weren't seeing a sick old man who was a burden to his family. They were seeing him. They were seeing the genius, the artist, the human being that she knew was still trapped inside somewhere. The old man, however, didn't turn around to take a bow. He didn't smile at the applause. In fact, he looked startled by it. As the loud cheers washed over him, his body seemed to shrink. The straight, confident posture he had while playing slowly collapsed. His shoulders slumped forward again. The light in his eyes, which had been so bright and fierce just seconds ago, flickered and went out. The magic was fading. He pulled his hands back from the keys and placed them in his lap, staring down at them as if they belonged to someone else. He looked confused. He looked like a man who had woken up from a vivid dream and couldn't remember where he was. The roar of the crowd seemed to scare him. He flinched and turned his head left and right, his eyes darting around anxiously. The daughter stepped forward quickly, brushing her tears away. She gently touched his shoulder. "Dad?" she said softly. "You did amazing. Everyone loved it." The old man looked up at her. The recognition was there, but it was faint. The sharp clarity of the music was gone, replaced by the cloudy fog of his illness. He looked at her face, then at the cheering crowd, and then back at the piano keys. "Did I make that noise?" he asked, his voice small and shaky. It was very loud. "Yes," she laughed through her tears, squeezing his shoulder. "You made that noise. It was beautiful." The crowd was still cheering, waiting for him to acknowledge them. But the old man didn't understand. He didn't know why they were shouting. He looked frightened. He tried to stand up, but his legs were weak from sitting still for so long. He stumbled slightly. The atmosphere in the station shifted instantly. The people watching weren't just an audience anymore. They were guardians. The moment they saw him stumble, 3 different people stepped forward to help. The security guard rushed over, but he wasn't reaching for handcuffs or a radio. He reached out a steady hand to support the old man's elbow. "Easy there, sir," the guard said kindly. "Take your time." "Here, let me help," a young woman in a gym outfit said. Moving a suitcase out of the way, the daughter looked at them, overwhelmed by their kindness. Just 10 minutes ago, these people were annoyed by her father. They were bumping into him and ignoring him. Now, they were treating him like a VIP. It was a complete transformation, and it was all because of the music. The music had spoken for him when he couldn't speak for himself. With the help of the guard and his daughter, the old man stood up. He gripped his walking stick tightly. He looked out at the sea of faces. He didn't really know what was happening, but he seemed to sense that something good had occurred. He offered a shy, tentative little smile to the people nearest to him. This caused another wave of awes from the crowd. It was such a humble, innocent reaction from a man who had just played like a master. "Thank you, sir," a young man called out from the back. "That was incredible." "Yeah." "Play another one," shouted someone else. But the old man shook his head slowly. He was tired. The energy it took to play that piece had drained him completely. You could see it in his face. The color was draining from his cheeks, and his eyes were drooping. The genius had gone back into hiding, leaving just a tired, confused old man in its wake. "I think we are done for today," the daughter said to the crowd, her voice trembling but loud enough to be heard. "Thank you. Thank you so much for listening." The crowd began to part, creating a clear path for them. It was like the Red Sea parting. People stepped back with smiles and nods of respect. No one was rushing. No one was checking their watches. They watched the old man shuffle away as if he were royalty. As they began to walk toward the train platforms, the daughter felt a change in the air around her father. The heavy, suffocating feeling of sadness was still there, but it was lighter now. It was mixed with a profound sense of pride. She realized that even though the disease was taking away his mind, it couldn't touch everything. It couldn't touch the part of him that could create beauty. It couldn't touch the love he had for music. Even if he didn't remember what it was called, they walked slowly past the shops and the ticket machines. The old man walked with a bit more energy than before, fueled by the kindness of strangers and the rush of adrenaline from the performance. He looked at his daughter. "I'm hungry," he said simply. She smiled and wiped the last tear from her cheek. "Okay, Dad, we can get a snack." "Do you want a cookie?" "Yes," he nodded. "A cookie?" It was such a normal, everyday conversation. But to her, it felt like a victory. They weren't just a patient and a caregiver struggling through a hard day anymore. They were a father and a daughter sharing a moment of triumph. The station was still noisy. The trains were still running. But everything was different now. She knew that no matter how dark the days got ahead, she had this memory. She had the memory of the time her father stopped the world with just his hands. The walk to the food court felt different than the walk to the piano had been just 20 minutes ago. Before, the crowds were an obstacle, a wall of indifference that they had to fight through. Now, the sea of people seemed to part effortlessly for them. It was as if the old man was wearing an invisible crown. People didn't just step out of the way. They nodded. Some smiled warmly. A few even whispered, "Good job," as they passed by. The daughter held her father's arm a little tighter, guiding him toward a small kiosk that sold pastries and coffee. "Here we are, Dad," she said gently, leading him to a small table near the wall. "You sit here. I'll get the cookie." He sat down heavily, letting out a long, tired breath. The adrenaline that had fueled his performance was fading fast, leaving him looking small and frail in his big coat. He rested his hands on the table, staring at them again, turning them over and over as if checking to make sure they were still attached to his wrists. When she came back with a chocolate chip cookie and a bottle of water, his eyes lit up. It was a simple, childlike joy. He took the cookie with both hands and took a large bite, crumbs falling onto his coat. He didn't seem to notice or care. The daughter reached over and brushed the crumbs away, smiling. For a moment, they weren't a caregiver and a patient. They were just a father and daughter sharing a snack. "Do you remember the piano, Dad?" She asked him softly, watching his face closely. He stopped chewing for a second. He looked at her, his eyebrows scrunching together as he tried to dig through the fog in his brain. "The piano?" he repeated. "The black one?" "Yes, the big black one in the middle of the hall. You played it. You played a beautiful song." He swallowed his bite and looked down at his lap. A shy smile crept onto his face, but it was a confused smile. "I like the music," he said quietly. "It makes the noise go away." "What noise?" "The buzzing," he said, tapping his temple. "The buzzing in my head." The daughter felt a lump form in her throat. She had never heard him describe it that way before. She always assumed he was just confused, but maybe he was constantly suffering from a noise she couldn't hear, a chaotic static of lost memories and jumbled thoughts. And for those few minutes at the piano, the music had been loud enough to drown out the buzzing. It had given him peace. After he finished the cookie and drank some water, it was time to go. The announcement board flashed that their train was boarding. This was the part she had been dreading all day. This was the reason for the trip. They weren't going to a happy vacation spot. They were going to the care facility. The dread came back, sitting heavy in her stomach like a stone. For the last hour, she had forgotten about the facility. She had forgotten about the guilt of leaving him there. But now, reality was knocking on the door. She stood up and took his hand. "Come on, Dad, the train is here." He stood up, a bit slower this time. "Are we going home?" She hesitated. It was the hardest question she had faced all day. She couldn't lie to him, not after he had given her such a beautiful gift. "We are going to a new place, Dad. A place where there are nice people to help you. You'll have your own room and maybe they have a piano there?" He looked at her, his eyes searching hers for the truth. He didn't look scared this time. He just looked trusting. "Okay," he said simply. "As long as you come." "Always," she promised, her voice cracking. "I will always come back for you." They walked to the platform. The train was sleek and silver, waiting with its doors open. A gust of cold air blew from the tunnel, smelling of electricity and metal. This was the machine that was going to take him away from her home. But as she helped him step over the gap and onto the train, she realized that she wasn't losing him. The piano performance had changed everything. It had shown her that the man she loved wasn't gone. He was still in there, buried deep under the illness. He couldn't do his taxes anymore. He couldn't cook his own meals or remember her phone number. But he could feel. He could create. He had a soul that was still vibrant and alive. They found 2 seats together by the window. The train hissed and the doors slid shut, sealing them inside. A few minutes later, the landscape began to move. The city blurred past the window-tall buildings, turning into gray suburbs, then into green trees. The old man leaned his head against the glass, watching the world fly by. The daughter sat back and relaxed for the first time in days. She watched him. He looked peaceful. His hands were resting quietly on his lap. Those hands. She thought about how they had flown across the Keys a lifetime ago. They were old and wrinkled now, spotted with age, but they held a magic that she would never underestimate again. She thought about the people in the station. She thought about the security guard, the businessman, the teenagers. For 5 minutes, hundreds of strangers had stopped their busy lives to listen to her father. He had connected them all. He had turned a lonely Tuesday afternoon into a shared memory. That was his legacy. It wasn't the things he had forgotten. It was the beauty he had left behind. The train rattled over the tracks, creating a gentle rocking motion. The old man closed his eyes. Within minutes, his breathing became slow and steady. He was asleep. The daughter reached over and gently covered his hands with hers. She didn't feel the weight of the world on her shoulders anymore. She just felt gratitude. She was grateful for the time they had, and she was grateful that she had been there to witness his moment of brilliance. She looked out the window at the sky, which was turning a soft orange as the sun began to set. She knew that tomorrow would be hard. There would be more confusion, more struggles, and more days of saying goodbye to pieces of him. But she also knew that whenever she felt sad, she could close her eyes and hear the music. She could remember the sound of the piano filling the station, loud and clear, pushing away the buzzing. The music was over now. The silence had returned. But it wasn't an empty silence anymore. It was a silence full of love. She squeezed his hand gently, and even in his sleep, he squeezed back. He was still there. And no matter what came next, she knew she would always listen for the music.